Session, our topic is The Neuroscience of Trauma, a Social Model of Wellbeing with Steve Andrews. So Steve is a former software engineer with 20 years of experience creating enterprise business software solutions for companies large and small. After his own diagnosis at age 33, he now works to help create a safer, healthier world for all. He speaks regularly at events across North America, focusing on socio-emotional well-being, disability, and neurodiversity. So great to have you with us today, Steve.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So to start off with, what is social emotional well-being?
Social emotional well-being is, we think about well-being in a number of different contexts. We think about physical health, we think about, environmental health, but socio-emotional well-being is really the psychology and sociology, even neuroscience and biology of our well-being. What's the difference between surviving and thriving?
So you've prepared some slides for us today?
I have. And really, we want to start answering some questions. What if there is no such thing as bad behavior, right? What if emotional challenges are not individual failings? And what if the ways we've been conditioned to look at behavior and emotional well-being are perpetuating the challenges themselves? So I call Seattle home.
Yep.
And it's a beautiful spot. I'm a mountain person, right? There's lots of natural beauty and lakes and forests and rivers and spots like this that is just 42 miles outside of Seattle, and it usually takes 42 minutes to get there. But let's say you and I decide to go for a hike, and we're hiking along and we round a bend, and you're hiking ahead of me, and we round a bend and there's a bear. Right? Now this bear looks super cute, like he probably just wants a hug, right? But what happens when we see that bear? What happens inside our body? Well, Stephen Poore just coined the term neuroception, which is our sense of safety or sense of danger. And immediately we see the bear and our brain goes into fight or flight, right? And a cascade of hormones and physiological changes, our breathing changes, pupils dilate, digestion, our muscles tense up, our body even starts to circulate white blood cells as though we had already been attacked, right? So it wants to be as prepared as possible in case it needs to respond. And our rational brain kind of goes out the window, and we're in this hyper-focused, what do we do about this threat, right? Do we fight it? Do we flight? Do we freeze? But imagine you're hiking ahead of me and you see the bear, and I see your behavior, but I don't see the bear yet. Imagine I start asking you, what's wrong with you? This is unacceptable behavior. Calm down. Do you just not want to go for a hike? Are you trying to control the situation? Can't you just communicate in a courteous and polite manner? You're just trying to get attention. Maybe you need a timeout, or some meds, or therapy, or a behavior plan, or a psychiatric hold. At the very least, you'd be frustrated with me in that moment. But how many times do we see a child or an adult who's struggling, and we do the same thing? What's wrong with you? This is unacceptable behavior. Calm down. Do you just not want to do this? Are you trying to control the situation? Maybe you need a timeout or some meds or therapy. But the point we miss is that behavior is communication. Behavior is a response. Behavior itself is never the problem. Behavior is letting us know that there is a deeper problem going on that we're responding to. And especially with kids are always doing the best they can. And if they're not at where we think their best could be, what's driving that? People aren't giving us a hard time. They're having a hard time, right? We say that a lot in the autism space, but I've discovered as I've researched this more and more that principle extends much, much farther out. People aren't giving us a hard time. They're having a hard time. And kids, especially when they can't talk it out, they act it out. If they don't have the language, if they don't have the sometimes it's even the brain capacity hasn't developed for a certain type of regulation or control, right? And so the answer is not to respond with anger or frustration. It's to respond with compassion and support. They're having a hard time. How can we help them through that? It's worth noting that a lot of behavior is deemed attention seeking when really it's connection seeking. A kid might ask you the same question 20 times in a row, and it's actually not about the question at that point. It's what is they're looking for connection. We always need to look for the bears. So my work in this space really started with my own diagnosis. I was 33 years old in 2012, and it was just this profoundly life-changing moment to finally have answers for so many of the struggles that I'd faced. And of course, I did what a lot of autistic people do, and I decided I wanted to learn everything there is to know about this thing we call autism, right? And so I started studying up and doing a lot of research, and it started with autism, and then that took me into broader disability, and then that took me into emotional health, anxiety, depression, addiction, trauma, suicide. And it really started answering a lot of questions, even from my own life and the quote behavior problems, right, that I experienced as a kid. What were the answers? And so I know in a previous webinar, you've talked about polyvagal theory before. And this is a kind of a simplistic view of a good high level simplistic view of polyvagal theory. And this is another game changer here with understanding behavior, understanding emotion, and feelings. And it was created or published in 2011 by Dr. Stephen Porges. And at a high level, there's 3 states that we can be in, right? The green state is that social engagement, that safe, I'm safe and I'm social, and that's where learning and relating and behaving can happen. In fact, largely that's the only place that positive learning and relating and positive behavior happens. But when our brain, when that neuroception kicks in, that detection of danger kicks in, our nervous system then moves us into the yellow zone, which is the sympathetic, but it's the danger area. So we see things like fight or flight, and there's rage, anger, irritation, worry, and concern, right? It's fear mobilized. And it's worth pointing out that the yellow isn't always bad. When your favorite sports team goes out and is playing their game and they're gearing up to attack each other, right? They're kind of in the yellow zone at that point. And it's a positive in that way. It allows them to be focused on what's going on and the muscles to be prepared to do the things that they need to do, right? But a lot of rational thought breaks down starting in the yellow zone, right? That's partly why they train so much, and is so that they're ready for that moment in the sports analogy, right? And so we go in the fight or flight. But if our body then further detects that fight or flight is not going to be able to mitigate the challenge we're facing, we then move into the red zone. And that's kind of the life threat zone. So disassociation, numbness, depression, hopelessness, shame, those things are our brain saying, I can't fight or flight my way out of this. I need to just immobilize. And again, it's so many autistic folks, especially, sensory challenges are a big one, right? Or executive function or social challenges or even politics, like interpersonal politics, can move us into the yellow zone and even the red zone, right? The red zone, if we look at it, is really kind of that shutdown mode, right? The yellow zone is meltdown. The red zone is shutdown. But it's not just a tantrum, as some people think. The body is actually detecting danger and is trying its best to do what it can to keep us as safe as possible in that moment. And so many of the behaviors that we see in talking to parents and teachers and whatnot evolve out of the yellow zone and the red zone. And that's where we see so many of the challenges happen. So as I kept learning this stuff, I started realizing I started thinking about what are the underlying pieces that threaten our perceived sense of safety that contribute to behavior problems. And so I developed what I call the social model of emotional well-being. And basically, it follows the same guidelines as we talk about the medical model and the social model of autism, where the medical model of disability says there's something broken with the person, we have to fix it, and that leads to judgment and devaluation and low self-esteem. And unfortunately, this dominates the legal, political, and medical decision making, and severely impacts autistic people. They say the average person needs, 8 to 10, or it takes 8 to 10 positives to outweigh one negative. But when we think about the messages that autistic people receive, that they're broken, they're doing this wrong, we start to see why we have so many challenges with self-esteem, with behavior, with lots of other challenges. And of course, the converse to the medical model is the social model. And the social model basically says that, it's not a broken individual, it's a broken society, right? We can even break down the word disabled. Abled people are able to walk upstairs and read books and navigate their daily life with relative ease. And what happens is, for folks who are disabled, it means that the environment is not optimal for their experience of it, right? It could be, the books aren't in Braille, or there's not a wheelchair ramp. And so the word disabled itself is really a verb. We have been disabled by society, and that's kind of the social model of disability. And I took it to the next level or the next step with mine, and called it the social model of emotional well-being, because so often when we see behavior problems, when we see things, addiction and criminality and all sorts of challenges, our first instinct is to blame the character of the person, when so often the challenge is the context around the person. There was a study in the late 70s by Canadian psychologist Bruce K. Alexander called Rat Park. And in Rat Park, this was back in the don't do drug days, right? And a scientist came along and put a rat in a cage and gave it 2 water bottles, and one was just plain water and one was water laced with heroin. And naturally, the rat tried both water bottles and became addicted to the heroin, overdosed, and died. And they, replicated that again and again. And it fit the narrative that don't do drugs, don't even do it once, you'll become addicted and die. But Bruce K. Alexander came along and said, that's not how rats normally live their lives. They're highly social creatures. And so he created this giant room called Rat Park, and things to play on and things to do, and lots of rat friends around. And then he introduced the same 2 water bottles. And interestingly, the rats tried both bottles and they rejected the heroin water. As a next step, he started out with the original rat in a single cage, waited until it became addicted to the heroin water, and then put it into Rat Park. And fascinatingly, while the rat went through withdrawals, it started then rejecting the heroin water. It's common. I really believe that the opposite of addiction is connection, right? If everything feels awful in our lives and we find something that feels good, of course we're going to want to do it all the time, right? And so the key to addiction is not, the character of the person, but the context that they're in. And that's so much of behavior follows that same methodology. So there's a number of pieces to the model. The first one is positive social connection. And, John Joseph Powell said, "It's an absolute human certainty that no one can know their own beauty or perceive a sense of their own worth until it has been reflected back to them in the mirror of another loving, caring human being." Right? Fred Rogers said that everyone longs to be loved, and the greatest thing we can do is to let people know that they are loved and capable of loving. Right? That positive social connection, at our very core, we are social beings. And when that social connection is lacking, that can lead to lots and lots of problems like addiction and depression, suicide, behavior problems, right? So, and there's a number of pieces at it. We need acceptance and belonging, right? Exactly as we are. At our core, we're just hardwired for that connection, for that unconditional positive regard. Um,
Yeah, and the myth is that autistic people don't want or seek that kind of connection.
right. And that is absolutely a myth. We all, at our core, desire positive connection. The challenge for there's a number of challenges for autistic people in this realm. One is that there are a number of studies that have shown that within 50 to 500 milliseconds of meeting an autistic person, a non-autistic person deems them less worthy of social interaction. I mean, that first thin slice judgment, and they're already deeming that we're less worthy of interacting. It kind of runs counter the idea that autism doesn't have a look. And
Yeah.
they replicated this as well with just photographs. And somehow,
Okay.
through the photographs, neurotypical or non-autistic people deemed autistic people less worthy of social interaction. And so there's already a strike against us in the social sphere, right? And then you add on to it some of the social challenges that we face, and some of those are learned, right? And some of them learned after so much rejection, we become kind of it becomes kind of a learned helplessness, right? And um, and then there's stuff like sensory issues, and eye contact for many people is challenging for autistic people. There's a lot of information coming at us at once, and because of the way our brains process information, it it can be overwhelming for us. But that positive social connection is a super critical piece. The thing I'll say about this is that I've been to a number of in-person conferences where it's just autistic people, and all of those supposed social challenges that we face evaporated. Like, people were stimming and not making eye contact, and maybe they were even more monotone than I am, and on, and no one cared, right? It was it's it go,
It's almost the opposite. We love to meet other people who stim in public and speak in a similar way and all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
And it's almost like the opposite of what you were saying before about deeming this person as less worthy of social connection. When an autistic meets another autistic person, it's like, oh wow, look, someone who might understand me, someone who I can actually interact with. This will be really fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've experienced that at numerous events. It's wonderful, and that goes into kind of the double empathy problem, right? And again, the medical versus social model, and that it's not that autistic people suck at communication, it's that autistic people and non-autistic people have different forms of communication that aren't always compatible if we don't understand each other. And part of the problem is that, autistic people are, whether it's social skills training or whatnot, are taught that their way is bad. You have to conform to the neurotypical way. But we don't ever teach neurotypical people, hey, here's how to interact with autistic people, right? The second piece is environment. And some of these I'll go through quickly. They're part of a much larger talk, but our physical environment, right? And whether it's geographic or home or work, or the community, the sensory experience. Like I said, I love Seattle. I'm a mountain person. To me, that's just feels safe. But it's accessibility in the community. It's sensory. I remember doing a talk at a school and high school, I believe, and it was just long concrete hallways that were super echoey, and then the buzzer went off, and it was just this horrific electronic tone sound that it took me 5 or 10 minutes to get to re-regulate in order to actually give the talk. Those kinds of things. The next one is mission and purpose. And this is a super big challenge that a lot of autistic people face, and this one's really the question, why am I here? Right? It gets into self-agency and self-determination. And we know that the employment stats are pretty horrific for autistic people. But everybody wants to be able to contribute to the world in some positive way. Maybe it doesn't fit into a capitalistic model, but we all want, and every single person has gifts and strengths and intelligences and talents and something to offer the world to make it a better place in some way, right? And that also fills their soul with joy.
Yeah, and feeling like you are contributing adds to that sense of self-esteem and self-value and all of that as well.
Absolutely. And as as a next step, it leads to, more positive behavior. When you're not able to contribute, we have that desire. We see things like depression, we see things like low self-esteem, those kinds of problems. And sometimes it evolves out of, am I able to contribute to the world in a positive way? The next one is body and brain. And this one gets interesting because it includes things like exhaustion. We know about autistic shutdown, right? Where we just kind of collapse and aren't able to do anymore when we've been too strong for too long, and masking plays in here. But it's also sleep and diet and exercise and all sorts of fun neuroscience words like nociception and interoception. Interoception is the ability to feel what's going on inside our own bodies, right? And then there's hormones and disease and injury and medication. And, a lot of times, we see this a lot with non-speaking folks and, younger kids who don't speak, is that sometimes their behavior is because they're experiencing pain that they don't know how to communicate to their loved one, right? Or their caregiver. And that pain, it could be a toothache, it could be a stomach ache, but they don't have the language or the capacity to, or have, communication is a human right. And unfortunately, so many non-speaking autistic people have not been given a, appropriate, accessible form of communication. AAC or letterboards or typing or whatever it is. And so they don't have a way to communicate that what's going on, or they have a headache, or even, communicating about their feelings, right? And there's so many things here that are important to within body and brain to that affects behavior.
Yeah, my analogy for that one is that everyone knows what it's like to feel sick and tired. Like if you've ever had the flu, if you've ever been hungover, you're the same person, but if you feel terrible, it makes a big difference.
Yeah, sometimes I'll explain like a meltdown is, imagine you have, let's say a hangover, right? Maybe without the headache, or a migraine. And then you have to go into the New York Stock Exchange, right on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, which is just utter chaos and commotion. And how long before any of us would have a meltdown, right? And that's so true of all behavior, autistic or not, is that, we've all had days where we've had it up to here and we just snap, right? And when you consider the autistic experience of sensory overload and executive function and the interpersonal challenges and so many things, we start to understand, they're having a hard time, not giving us a hard time.
Yeah, especially when there's nowhere to escape to. So you can't just leave the room and everything's going to be fine if the whole world or the whole social situation is the cause of your overload or
and kids in school is the same issue. So many parents talk about how when their kids come home from school, they just go into meltdown. And of course, teachers say, well, they're not like that at school. It must be a home problem. But they don't realize that all day that kid has been desperately trying to hold it together, to keep things together. And when they get home to their safe place, that's where they can finally let it all out. Right? That they're having a hard time. But identity asks the question, who am I? And this is a really important one because for so many autistic people, The rates of anxiety and depression and suicide are so much higher than they are for the general population. And a good bit of it stems from this identity piece of who am I, right? What are the things we put our identity in? But what are, and for some of us, it can be good things like, I'm going to college, or I got married, or have a baby, or a promotion. Those are good identity changes. And then there's the difficult identity changes like divorce, or an empty nest, or a job change, or retirement even, right? So it's not always bad when things change, but this plays into questions like, am I allowed to be my authentic self? Am I allowed to express my authentic self? Am I valued and loved as my authentic self? And given the number of negative messages that so many autistic people receive, the answers to those questions are often no, right? They don't feel like they can be their authentic self. I mean, we talk about autistic masking all the time, and that's, because we don't feel safe as our authentic self with our friend group, or in the workplace, or at school, or wherever we are, right? And it's so important that we are, accepted just as we are.
Yeah, and if you go back to that point around connection, if you risk connection by being your true self, then how can you find a balance there without resorting to something like masking to try and get that connection that we all crave?
Right. So identity asks, who am I? Messages asks, who am I in the world? And this is, again, a lot of the messages that we receive. Some of them are cultural messages from whichever culture we live in. Some of these are past hurts and wounds and trauma we experienced. And, childhood trauma, and Dr. Nadine Burke Harris calls it toxic stress, is a significant problem in our world, right? But those things, those situations teach us that we're not safe. We're not safe as our authentic selves. It could be demands, unrealistic demands and expectations. It could be microaggressions, right, along race or disability or any number of factors. It could be straight discrimination and ableism. And in many ways, our Western culture really is a shame-based culture. We're seeing that a lot on social media right now, but those messages all tell us that who I am in the world is wrong or bad, and that then leads to a host of other problems, right? Fred Rogers said that I don't think anyone can grow unless they're loved exactly as they are now, appreciated for what they are rather than who they will be. And the piece here is needs, and this is kind of around our basic needs, eating and food and shelter and water and hygiene and housing, communication, as we mentioned before, supports and accommodations, education, transportation, all the things that we require as human beings to thrive. And we look at this and think, how often are these things missing in autistic people's lives? Right? Supports and accommodations. The ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, was passed 30 years ago in the United States, but many autistic people in the United States still struggle with whether supported housing or supported education, or, and I kind of like using accessible, accessible education, accessible employment. So many challenges revolve around when our basic needs aren't met. It triggers to our brain that we're not safe. And therefore, that affects our socio-emotional well-being, right? We can't be thriving when our needs aren't met. So often we blame the individual for the challenge without recognizing that the context around the person is what's creating that challenge. But all of this, for too long, the disability conversation is focused almost entirely on the negative, right? The medical model: can't, won't, disorder, disease, stricken, burden, low functioning, low outcome, right? And yes, we do face some challenges. Some of them are in the world around us. Some of them are with our own bodies and neurology and, sensory or, you know, um, various other co-occurring conditions. But the other half of the story is also strengths. And so for me, I didn't have a single friend until high school. And it's not that I didn't have close friends, I didn't have any at all. But after high school, I found computers, right? And I was like, this is amazing. This is how my brain works. And that led to a career in software for 20 years, right? But it was through my strengths. And through that, then I met people, and I know people all over the world now. And it gave me a career, and it gave me income, and it gave me so many positive things. And I think that we need to tell the other half of the story, that we all have strengths, right? And so many of the problems I see are people, so many autistic people I see don't have a great understanding of what their gifts, talents, strengths, intelligences are. And then even if they do, they don't have a way to get them out into the world, right?
Yeah, sometimes employment makes the difference between for someone's social emotional well-being. I mean, if you've got a job, you've got money, you can afford to support your family, you can afford to meet your basic needs, you've got some basic social interaction, you've got a reason for getting out of bed every morning. Whereas if you don't have that, then it's much harder to start trying to find all of those pieces. I mean, you've got 7 pieces listed here, and all of them are necessary. And if you have to try and find all of them in a different spot, then that's really challenging.
Yeah. And, there's a list of strengths on the screen that aren't necessarily the traditional strengths we think about, right? And I argue there's the theory of multiple intelligences, and I kind of argue that there's hundreds, if not thousands, of different intelligences, right? Being able to speak in front of a crowd is an intelligence, being able to expertly drive a car is an intelligence, right? There's so many different things um, that are strengths and intelligences. And I think one of the questions we need to ask starting at a very young age is, how do we better identify and nurture strengths in autistic people, right? And not initially from a career standpoint, but just, if there's a kid who likes to line up their cars and loves organizing things, well, let's foster that. Let's nurture that. Let's encourage that, because that could potentially be a career in logistics. And every company out there needs a logistics person who's good at that stuff, right? When it comes time for a career. Or the kid that's in the vacuum cleaners, who's to say that if he's not encouraged in that, doesn't grow up and invent a brand new type of vacuum? Or, most of us aren't, Einstein. Maybe they're the curator at a vacuum museum, but they're happy and thriving as who they are.
And what this really clearly shows is how interactive all of these things are. So you might be encouraging this particular strength, and that might be giving a positive social message. It might also be a way of connection. It might also eventually be a job, but who knows? It might be a social connection. It might help with identity. They're all interconnected. So even just by focusing on supporting one particular strength, even if it doesn't seem to be directly relevant, they're all interrelated.
Yeah. And that's exactly my next slide here, which is they are interconnected. And that's my own story, right? I found mission and purpose through computers, and through that, I found positive social connection. And I moved to Seattle, which is a great environment for me. And, I was able to get healthcare, which is body and brain. And it sent positive messages to me being in that space and doing well in that space. There are so many benefits. So they are all connected. As we start to address one area, it can start to positively affect other areas. But the ring around all of this comes back to safety. And going back to the very beginning in polyvagal theory and behavior, is that safety is the at our very core, even more than positive social connection and our hardwiring for social connection, is a desire for safety, right? And I really believe that all behavior can be seen through the lens of, if I do this or I don't do that, then I will be safe, right? Someone who is super aggressive may have learned at some point, maybe they were bullied as a kid and they learned, rightly or wrongly, that if I'm super aggressive, I won't get bullied again and therefore I am safe, right? And when we stop and step back and look at behavior through that lens and start to try and understand, where's the safety here? Where are they seeking safety and in this situation, right? And it's perceptual safety, not objective safety. It's how the person perceives that safety. And it can be all sorts of different, we generally think of it in terms of physical safety, but it can also be sexual safety and emotional safety and psychological safety and housing safety and financial and employment safety, education, healthcare, benefits. I mean, safety comes in so many different flavors other than just physical.
Yeah, even just the desire for a routine or to know what's happening during the day and things like that.
Yeah. So finally, what links this all together is relationship, right? Safe enough, healthy enough relationships. It's the question, how would my soul feel love if I were them? And so often we look at behavior, and especially with autistic people, and we try and educate. I see parents and teachers try and educate someone right away, but we can't do that unless we're in the green zone, unless we're in that safe and social zone. And so in aviation, there's a hierarchy of things that is called aviate, navigate, communicate, right? Keep the plane in the air, and then you can navigate, and then you can communicate. If you're not doing things in that order, you're in trouble. But when dealing with behavior, it's regulate, relate, reason, right? Before we can do anything, we have to get someone back down to a level of regulation, right? So many times behavior is feeling dysregulated. So we have to get someone back to a point of feeling regulated and safe. And then it comes down to relationship. There has to be trust. That's part of safety. And there has to be trust and that safety within a relationship. And then we can get to reasoning with someone, right? So in the middle of a meltdown, is not the time to start educating someone, right? You wait till later, you get them back to safety, and then later, afterwards, you can talk about it. Hey, what happened? What were you feeling, thinking? What triggered that for you? And it can be a great opportunity at that point to help give someone language to talk about
Mm.
what's going on. But that relationship is so important. And so often we look at behavior and think we need to fix the person. But societally, culturally, we've been conditioned to look at behavior and well-being as a character problem, a deficit, a failure of the individual. Good behavior equals reward, bad behavior equals punishment. But we need to look deeper. We need to ask why. We need to be that explorer and start to understand, look, where the context might be the problem, right? And that could completely shift how we approach behavior, at home, in the classroom, in the workplace, criminal justice, mental health, and every other facet of our societies. And if we could do that, then, you know, it's my position that we'll have a much better, safer, healthier world for everyone. And so I invite people to start applying this model today. Talk about it with friends and colleagues. Start seeing how you can apply it to relationships that you have now to change how we think about behavior and emotional well-being, because it can significantly change the trajectory of people's lives. So ultimately, the question is now, will you look for the bears?
Okay, thanks for that, Steve. That's a really powerful message around changing our focus essentially to looking at the environment rather than looking at the person, and understanding a person and their behavior in the context of the environment. So, but before we say goodbye, is there any final message that you'd like to give to parents or teachers that are trying to implement this or take these messages into their daily life?
Yeah, I think one of the important things to understand is that if we're trying to solve the problem once it's already escalated to a meltdown or a behavior problem. We've missed numerous opportunities along the way to have mitigated that before it got to that point, right? So if that has happened, a great thing to do would be to debrief on it essentially and understand what triggered that and how you can better set that person up for success next time. Whether it's the context, the sensory, maybe it's helping them develop language and understanding and of the challenges they're facing so that they can even articulate it. We need to
Mm.
start mitigating problems before they get to the point of, seclusion and restraint and whatnot.
Yeah, a phrase that I like is don't tell me to self-regulate, help me to self-regulate. So that's
Absolutely.
a pretty big change there. Okay, well, thanks a lot for this today, Steve. And for everyone watching, I hope you've found this very valuable, and make sure you check out all the other sessions at the Autism Explained online summit. Thanks.